Oh, God.
There's another one. There was another one.
Very, very quickly, there are more explosions further down the building. Explosion. The building is exploding with people running up the street.
This is the 9/11 iceberg chart. Initially, I was going to start with an intro explaining what happened, but at this point, I'm not interested in wasting your time. If you're watching this, chances are you already know what happened on the morning of September 11th, and I don't need to restate the obvious. Before we go any further, though, first off, this iceberg chart was created by Reddit user MathMetalhead and was instrumental in creating this video, so thank you to them for that. However, I will at times add additional entries myself to provide context or share bits of information I personally wanted to include. You will know these are my own entries because they will be highlighted in green like so. We have a lot to cover, so let's take a deep dive into the 9/11 iceberg. Layer 1. North and South Towers. The World Trade Center was a complex of high-rise office buildings that began construction in 1968 and were opened in 1973. As a way to bring urban renewal back to Lower Manhattan. Funded partially by Nelson and David Rockefeller, the towers were designed by Japanese architect Minoru Yamasaki, who sought to create a design that would reflect his fear of heights. He made the windows very narrow to provide a sense of security and used a system of steel beams to form load-bearing walls, leaving more interior space to use for elevators, leasable office space, commercial space, and so on. This design choice was a marvel in 1968, but would unfortunately lead to the Trade Center's downfall. On 9/11, the plane struck the towers in such a way that many of these beams were severed, and the hollow nature of the buildings meant that the 10,000 gallons of jet fuel could easily combust and penetrate throughout the structure. Most of the emergency stairwells and elevators were blocked or destroyed, save for one stairwell in the South Tower, where a few survivors managed to escape. The fires weakened the steel cores, and as the floors began to sag, the exterior walls bent inwards, eventually giving way to a full collapse. The North Tower was struck first at 8:46 a.m. and kept standing all the way until 10:28 a.m., lasting for a total of 102 minutes. The South Tower was struck at approximately 9:02 a.m. and only managed to last until 9:59 a.m., less than an hour. In total, 2,192 civilians and 414 police, fire, and medical officials were killed in the collapse. Of the bodies pulled from the wreckage, only 20 were alive. The former site of the World Trade Center now houses the National September 11th Memorial and Museum, while a new complex began construction in 2004. The main building in this new complex, One World Trade Center, is currently the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere, standing at a patriotic 1,776 feet. As of the making of this series, only buildings 1, 3, 4, and 7 have been completed. Flight 11 and Flight 175. These were the two commercial aircraft used to strike the North and South Towers, respectively. Flight 11 was an American Airlines-owned Boeing 767 that was taken over by lead MOHAMMED, and Flight 175 was another 767, this time owned by United Airlines, that was taken over by Marwan al-Sheikhi. During the hijacking, at 8:24 a.m., Atta was overheard by Boston air traffic controllers making what sounded like an announcement to the passengers.
Buddy, we have some planes, just stay quiet and you'll be okay. We're returning to the airport. Nobody move. Everything will be okay. If you try to make any move, you'll injure yourself and the airplane. Just stay quiet.
It's theorized that Atta meant to activate the intercom, but accidentally keyed the wrong switch, and instead broadcast himself to ATC. In fact, before they were removed from the cabin, the pilots of 175 were asked about Flight 11, to which they reported hearing the broadcast. Marwan made no such error during the subsequent hijacking of 175, which began at 8:37 a.m. On the other hand, while Atta turned off his flight's transponder, Marwan did not, meaning air traffic control could track his location all the way up until the time of impact. Flight 11 struck between the 93rd and 99th floors in a head-on collision, and Flight 175 struck at a right-leaning tilt between floors 77 and 85. A combined total of 147 people on board were killed, not counting the 5 per flight. The flight numbers have since been retired by both United and American. Flight 77. Flight 77 was an American Airlines Boeing 757 that was used to crash into the Pentagon. The 5 terrorists on board were led by Hani Hanjour, who took control of the aircraft once the men had disposed of the pilots. The plane then impacted the western side of the Pentagon building at 9:37 a.m. Only 3 videos exist of Flight 77, 2 of these being digital security cameras mounted on the exterior of the Pentagon building. The footage is unfortunately 1 frame per second, so the plane, although it can be made out, is barely recognizable. The 2 security camera angles from the Pentagon are often confused to be from one camera, but further inspection shows that they are indeed from 2 separate angles. The 3rd angle was from a nearby hotel's tape-based security camera. The FBI later confiscated the hotel footage and another tape from a nearby gas station, which has yet to be released to the public. The impact caused a massive explosion and a long-lasting fire, which caused a section of the building to collapse. By that time, however, the section in question had been fully evacuated, so no one was injured as a direct result of the collapse. In total, 189 people died in the crash and subsequent fires, including 59 civilians in the plane itself. Flight 93. Flight 93 was the last of the aircraft to be crashed on September 11th, and the one we know the least about. The Boeing 757 was planned to take off at 8 a.m. along with the other flights, but air traffic forced the plane to the ground until 8:42, less than 5 minutes before Flight 11 would first strike the World Trade Center. Because of this late start, many passengers phoning their loved ones became aware of the previous flights and were able to discern what was going on quicker. Brief mayday calls were also heard on air traffic control from the pilots as they struggled to fight the followed by one of them, Ziad Jarrah, accidentally calling air traffic control again instead of using the intercom again. The passengers on Flight 93 decided then and there that they would attempt to storm the cockpit and regain control of the plane.
You ready? Let's roll.
Using the food cart as a makeshift battering ram, they began to break down the doors separating the cockpit from the rest of the plane. In a final act of desperation, the plunged the aircraft into an empty field, instantly killing all 44 people aboard. It was later discovered that the potential targets of Flight 93 were either going to be the Capitol building or the White House itself. No footage exists of Flight 93, save for a single image of the plume of smoke rising from the crash site. South Tower impact footage. Due to the surprise nature of the attack, very few videos exist of Flight 11 impacting the North Tower, but many videos exist of Flight 175 striking the South Tower. These range from news station helicopter shots, to fixed television cameras, to amateur videotapes shot by civilians. There are a total of 70 known shots of the second plane, with probably the most recognizable shots being filmed by Michael Herzakani, Evan Fairbanks, Park Foreman,
Holy shit!
Chris Hopewell,
Holy fuck!
Oh my god! Oh my god! Jesus fucking Christ!
and most recently, Kevin Westley, who was actually filming from the same ferry as Herzakani, just at a different angle.
Oh my lord! Oh my lord!
JULES and GEDEON NAUDET footage. JULES and GEDEON NAUDET are a pair of French filmmaking brothers who had been teamed up with the New York City Fire Department to shoot a documentary about a rookie firefighter learning the ropes. On 9/11, GEDEON stayed at the fire station, while JULES rode along with the team who were sent to investigate a possible gas leak. While filming, everybody started to hear a strange sound, almost like a jet engine soaring above. You could actually see Chief of Battalion 1, Joseph Pfeiffer, look around to try and identify the noise. Naudet quickly pans to the Twin Towers, and thus he was responsible for capturing the best known angle of the first plane's impact. JULES would later enter the North Tower with Pfeiffer and his team, filming their terrified reactions at the carnage and, later on, the collapse of the South Tower from inside the North. Meanwhile, GEDEON NAUDET took to the streets in an attempt to find his brother, even managing to film the second plane's impact before he was stopped from going any further into the World Trade Center plaza. After the collapse of the two towers, JULES and GEDEON would later tearfully reunite at the firehouse, and they sold their incredible footage to CBS. The subsequent documentary, simply titled 9/11, was released in 2002, and won the duo 2 Primetime Emmy Awards, 3 separate Emmy nominations, an award from the Television Critics Association, and a Peabody Award. Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden was the founder and leader of Al-Qaeda from 1988 until his death in 2011. He was born to a wealthy family and joined Afghan forces fighting the Soviet Union in 1979. Said Afghan forces were indirectly funded by none other than the United States, due to their anti-communist sentiments. He would later separate from the Afghan rebels and form his own military fighting group, later renamed Al-Qaeda, just before the start of the Gulf War. Bin Laden, despite his past dealings, rejected all forms of U.S. involvement with protecting Saudi affairs. After being banished from Saudi Arabia and then Sudan, he returned to Afghanistan, where he declared a jihad against the United States for their invasion of Saudi Arabia and their close ties with Israel. Under bin Laden's control, Al-Qaeda committed numerous smaller terrorists, including the 1998 U.S. Embassy bombings in East Africa, which killed 224 people and which earned him a spot on the FBI's top 10 most wanted fugitives by the end of the 90s. While he initially denied responsibility for 9/11, tapes leaked to the press in November of 2001 showed bin Laden speaking in a way that implies he had foreknowledge of the attacks. These would be confirmed by a later videotape of him in 2004, where he first publicly took credit for the events of September 11th. He stated he was inspired by the 1982 destruction of towers in Lebanon by Israeli forces, and he wanted to deliver the same punishment to the Americans. He would remain hidden from the public for 10 years, only making appearances through eerie videotapes discussing his plans for jihad and raving against the United States. That is, until May 2nd, 2011. A team of U.S. Navy SEALs conducted a surprise raid on a Pakistani compound bin Laden was thought to be hiding out in. He was subsequently found cowering behind who was believed to be one of his many wives before he was shot point-blank in the head where he stood. His body was unceremoniously dumped into the ocean. Al-Qaeda as an organization still exists today, just without the power they once held in the early 2000s. KHALID Sheikh Mohammed. For the sake of my dumb American ass, we're just going to call him KSM. Whereas OSAMA was the big scary figurehead of the events of September 11th, KSM was the actual mastermind. He was the primary Al-Qaeda member responsible for planning 9/11. At least, that's what we've been told. KSM's involvement with Missouri can be traced back to the year 1994, where he, along with his nephew Ramzi Youssef, remember him, he'll come up later, created Operation Bojinka, a terrorist plot to detonate bombs on 12 separate U.S. aircraft, in addition to flying one into the CIA headquarters. Once the plot was discovered and he was charged with Missouri by the U.S., he fled to Afghanistan in 1996 and set up a working relationship with bin Laden. KSM wouldn't become a full-fledged member of Al-Qaeda until after the aforementioned 1998 bombings, in which he became the leader of the organization's propaganda wing. Stemming from the failure that was the Bojinka plot, KSM reintroduced the idea of using planes as Zeus bombers that would crash into buildings. With the help of bin Laden, this plan was simplified and refined, with KSM himself selecting the targets and facilitating travel for the Surkaj. It was also KSM who insisted the planes be flown into buildings. Bin Laden was eager to strike the U.S. and thought it would be sufficient to just down the planes, but KSM was adamant on the symbolic impact the destruction of the buildings would cause the Americans. He would take credit for the Holy Tuesday operation in 2002 during an interview with Al Jazeera, though this was later disputed by his personal representative. 1 year later, members of the Pakistani Inter-Service Intelligence, in conjunction with the CIA, captured KSM and extradited him to the United States. He would be subject to torture numerous times during his interrogations, which included waterboarding, sleep deprivation, and even forced rectal rehydration. All of these would later be classified as torture by organizations such as the Red Cross and the Human Rights Watch. Eventually, in 2007, after 4 years of imprisonment, he finally confessed to plotting the 9/11 attacks, while also taking responsibility for other attacks, including an earlier bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993, an Indonesian nightclub bombing in 2002, and many other plots which never came to fruition. He was formally charged with Missouri in 2008 and is currently imprisoned in the infamous Guantanamo Bay as his trial slowly continues in the court of law. At this point, it's going to take longer to prosecute the man for destroying the World Trade Center than it will to finish rebuilding the actual World Trade Center. Jumpers. Yeah, you knew this was coming. So as we mentioned previously, the crash of the airplanes virtually knocked out all emergency stairwells in both Twin Towers, -1. This means that most of the people at or above the impact site were trapped with little chance of being rescued. As such, some people had decided that they would rather die a quick death rather than be slowly burned alive or suffocated from the smoke. And that's exactly what they did. Several of these jumpers were photographed or caught on video during their final descent. The most famous of these is, of course, the falling man, but we'll get to him later on. Personally, what struck me most was this clip from Jules NAUDET, as the fire crews began to hear crashing sounds from outside the plaza. You can see the expressions on their face change when they realized that sound wasn't debris falling to the ground. It was bodies falling to the ground.
I just remember looking up, thinking, how bad is it up there that the better option is to jump?
War on terror. This phrase does not necessarily denote a specific war or military action. Rather, it is used to refer colloquially to the United States' series of actions against Missouri. Kind of like how the war on drugs wasn't supposed to be an actual war against drugs. Well, former President Bush first used the phrase 5 days after 9/11 in a statement to the press, days after passing a bill authorizing the use of military against those responsible for the attacks.
This crusade, this war on Missouri, is going to take a while.
These remarks were followed by the first actions of the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, in addition to the passing of the U.S. Patriot Act. Many of these military actions were heavily criticized, and the U.S. government would begin to use the phrase war on terror less and less until it was dropped completely by former President Obama.
Our systematic effort to dismantle Missouri must continue. But this war, like all wars, must end.
The war itself still continues to be felt in certain regions of the world, with the last of the American troops leaving Afghanistan as late as September 2021, 20 whole years after it all began. Layer 2. The Falling Man. This refers to an image taken by AP photographer Richard Drew of a man falling from the World Trade Center. This is probably what most people think of when they think of the term jumpers, as this image was reprinted in numerous newspapers across the U.S. and was even the subject of a 2006 documentary. Despite its acclaim, the photograph has also seen some backlash for its wide publication, with some readers calling it, quote, cold-blooded, ghoulish, and sadistic. Their outrage is to an extent understandable, but it's strange to me how people can watch hours upon hours of horrific explosions and collapses and warfare, but a single man falling through the air, that's too ghoulish to show the public. The 2006 documentary, directed by Henry Singer, attempts to identify the man, ultimately concluding that he was likely an audio engineer who worked at the North Towers restaurant, named Jonathan Briley. He's been identified as such by members of his family, but his identity has never been officially confirmed. Man in the Red Bandana. Wells Crowther was an equities trader working in the World Trade Center who helped save over a dozen people who were lost and injured in the South Tower. Upon successfully making it past the impact site from his office on the 104th floor, he went back up and helped direct people to the aforementioned only working stairwell. He would even carry some critically injured people on his back all the way down to the lobby, thanks to his training as a volunteer firefighter. His nickname refers to his trademark red bandana, which he had worn throughout most of his life after it was given to him by his father. In the towers, he had put it over his face as a makeshift mask. Sadly, Wells would end up dying during the collapse of the South Tower. Wells's family would not know of his heroism until they read accounts from survivors describing the man in the red bandana that helped them. What's even more depressing is, upon searching his apartment after his death, his family found a completed application form to become a member of the FDNY. He was named an honorary New York City firefighter by Fire Commissioner Nicholas Capetta in 2006, finally fulfilling one of his lifelong dreams. Kevin Cosgrove and Calls from the Towers. There's a British documentary produced by Channel 4 Productions that goes into more depth on this topic than I could ever dream of. It's available on Amazon, so if you want a more comprehensive look at all the phone calls made from the towers and planes, I recommend you check that out. We're going to focus on primarily Kevin Cosgrove. Kevin was working in the World Trade Center as the vice president of Aon Corporation when 175 struck, and he is most well known today for the call he placed to 911 dispatchers, of which only 5 minutes is known to exist. The recording begins in the middle of the call. Cosgrove can be heard alongside a man named Doug Cherry and an unknown third person as they seek shelter in John Ostro's office. Kevin desperately pleads with the operator for any kind of help. His fear and frustration is palpable. Something you have to realize is that Kevin states numerous times he is on the 105th floor. As we know, the plane crashed between floors 77 and 85 in Tower 2. What this means is that at 9:59 a.m., when the tower fell, it didn't collapse onto him like you would think. It actually fell out from underneath him.
We're looking at financial center. Between us, 2 broken windows.
Several other unreleased phone calls were made from both the towers and the airplanes, though most only survive via accounts from family members or transcripts from the 9/11 Commission. Brian Clark and Stanley PRAIMNATH. Stanley PRAIMNATH was an executive for Fuji Bank who worked on the 81st floor. Brian Clark was an executive for Eurobrokers on the 84th floor. When the North Tower was hit, Clark remained at his post, while Stanley attempted to leave the building with one of his co-workers. He was stopped by security who had deemed his tower safe and gave him clearance to go back in. Once Stanley got back to his desk, he took a phone call from another associate of his, and as he was doing so, he spotted the second plane rapidly approaching.
I'm hypnotized standing up there. I'm not having time to react. Or I'm looking at this plane, and it's getting bigger. Lord, I can't do this, you take over. And I dove under my desk.
Flight 175 hits the second tower, but miraculously Stanley survived, although he was trapped under debris. Meanwhile, Brian and his co-workers were descending the stairs when a woman stopped them and told them they couldn't go that way because there's too much smoke and fire. She claimed their only chances of being rescued were on the roof. While his group debated on what to do next, Brian heard Stanley's cries from outside the stairwell and went to save him. As he exited the stairwell, he turned back to see most of his colleagues going back up. They all would later die in the collapse. Brian managed to hoist Stanley over a wall, and the two continued down the stairs until they reached floor 31, where they were able to call their loved ones and 911 operators. As they finally exited the building through the lobby, Stanley remarked how,
"You know, I think that tower could come down.
And I don't know why I'm telling this man this building is going. But I knew it was not over."
I said, "There's no way. That's a steel structure. That's just draperies and carpets and furniture burning. You know, there's no way." And I didn't finish my sentence when the tower started to slide.
After 9/11, the two men remained very close friends. Brian retired in 2006 and now does mainly non-profit work, while Stanley became a motivational speaker, sharing his story of survival underneath the lens of God.
This man took my hand, and he held his hand like this. And this man stared me in the eyes and he told me something that I'll go to the grave with. He said, all my life I live as an only child. I always wanted a brother, and I find that man today. In his hand, he had a gash in his left palm. He took my right hand and did like this. And he rubbed these two hands together and he says, from today, you're my blood brother. And this man put his hand around my shoulder. He says, come on, buddy, let's go home.
Gwyneth Paltrow's sliding doors moment. The phrase sliding doors moment is used to refer to a seemingly inconsequential incident that nonetheless alters the course of history. It comes from the Gwyneth Paltrow movie of the same name released in 1998. Consequently, she would have one of those moments herself, as a woman named Laura Ludstrom Clark was rollerblading across the street in New York City. She narrowly avoided being hit by Paltrow's SUV. Clark stood there for a second, starstruck, before realizing she was going to be late for work. This chance encounter meant that she would miss her train, which means she would eventually end up arriving at the World Trade Center 1 minute after Flight 11 had struck the building. That 1 minute essentially saved her life. Celebrities cheated death. A handful of other celebrities also narrowly avoided death, either because they missed their flights or they never made it to the World Trade Center on time. Both Mark Wahlberg and Seth MacFarlane were scheduled to board Flight 11, but Mark decided to travel to Toronto last minute for a film festival, while Seth was hungover and missed his boarding by 10 minutes. Michael Jackson was said to have had a meeting planned at the Trade Center for that day. No idea why specifically there, but overslept after he spent all night talking with his mother and his sister. Rob Lowe claims he sat next to the terrorists during a dry run aboard Flight 77. There's not much else to say with this one. Steve Buscemi. Speaking of celebrities, Steve Buscemi was not only in New York City on 9/11, but he actually volunteered at Ground Zero. Way back in 1980, before he had ever acted in a film, he was part of the FDNY, Engine Company Number 55 in Little Italy.
You handle my ass.
Upon seeing the devastation, he attempted to call the fire station he used to work at, but he couldn't get through. So he walked right down to the destroyed plaza and got to work. He was there for 5 days, digging through the rubble and helping however he could. He refused any interviews or photos, insisting he was not there for the publicity, just to help people out. Steve reported suffering from PTSD due to his experience, saying, "I was only there for like 5 days, but when I stopped going and tried to just live my life again, it was really, really hard." He continues to produce and help out on various projects relating to 9/11, including the 2014 documentary, Dust, The Lingering Legacy of 9/11.
We are approaching, the same number of deaths of firefighters, from 9/11 cancer-related issues than what happened on the day itself. But I think what hurt the most was that they were not being properly taken care of once the cancers started to happen. Everybody at the time around 9/11 was that we wouldn't forget, and they felt forgotten.
Salty and Roselle. Salty and Roselle were both guide dogs who coincidentally both happened to be in the same tower of the World Trade Center at the moment the plane struck. Salty, who was on the 71st floor, dutifully led his owner, Omar Rivera, to safety, while Roselle, up on the 78th floor, helped guide Michael Hingson down the entire Stairwell B. By the time both dogs made it outside the building, Tower 2 was minutes away from collapsing. Both dogs are sadly dead now, but they both received a joint PDSA Dickin Medal for their bravery.
And I'm going down with a guide dog that has not enough space. It probably is too much for him. I say, well, Salty, maybe it is better for you to go. Salty continued his way down. But at one point, he decided, no, I cannot go without him. So he came back. He was telling me, I am with you. No matter what, I am with you.
Pasquale Buzzelli. Pasquale worked on the 64th floor of the North Tower and had phoned his wife twice, assuring her he was going down stairwell B and that he'd be fine. As he reached about the 22nd floor, the tower began to collapse. Somehow this man managed to surf down 18 stories of a collapsing building and end up alive on top of a pile of debris. Firefighters shortly thereafter found him, hoisted him to safety, and he was out of the hospital and back to work within 3 months. There's being committed to the grind, and then there's being Pasquale BUZZELI. The miracle survivors. We know by now that all of the stairwells in the North Tower were destroyed to everyone above the impact zone, but below it, many of the staircases were also flooded with smoke, making them unusable. Stairwell B was the only clear one. Around 16 people managed to survive the collapse of the North Tower because they were in Stairwell B. These people became known as the miracle survivors, and included Pasquale as well as Fire Captain J. Jonas and 5 of his crewmen from Ladder 6. Jonas had ordered his men to evacuate the building when he felt Tower 2 collapse. The team also managed to rescue Josephine Harris, a bookkeeper at the Port Authority that had a broken leg from a previous injury. The stairs were not being too kind to her. It was because of slowing down to help her that David Lim, a canine officer, managed to survive as well in Stairwell B. There's a very good article in New York Magazine that goes a little more in-depth on these people, so I recommend checking that out. EDNA CINTRON or Karen Juday. This entry refers to a person that can be seen trapped beneath rubble just below the impact zone of the North Tower. She appears to be waving a shirt or a piece of cloth to try and get anyone's attention. The identity of this person has been determined to be EDNA CINTRON, a 46-year-old employee for Martian McLennan. However, some falsely claim the woman in the photo is actually Karen Juday, but that's not the right picture. This isn't Karen Juday. This is one of the many photographs taken by previously mentioned photographer Richard Drew. Upon the outrage over the falling man, the rest of his photos remained stashed away and unprinted, until her fiancé, Richard Pecorella, requested to see them. He had been desperately looking for any trace of his wife since she disappeared on 9/11, and was able to point Karen out based on the clothes she was wearing that day. Blue sweater, cream pants. I'm glad he was able to get at least some closure on his then-to-be wife, as they were only able to recover a single bone of hers from the wreckage site. Even though it is a very horrifying and gruesome photo, it's her last moments, captured forever in a photograph. I think that still meant a lot to him.
I miss her eyes. Her eyes sparkled to me. One day they were blue, next day they were green, depending on how the light hit them. Karen, I'll always be in love with you, and I will see you again. I will do enough good to make it up there.
Entertainment impact. Nearly all forms of entertainment in the United States were impacted due to the events of 9/11. There's far too many to properly dissect and point out each change that was made. Radio stations stopped playing certain songs that talked about destruction and bombs and planes and stuff. Episodes of TV shows and kids' cartoons were altered to remove any similarities to the attacks, no matter how bizarre. Late-night talk shows and comedy shows took an entire 2 weeks break because they felt their work wasn't appropriate in the aftermath of such a tragedy.
I wanted to tell you why I grieve.
Movie releases were delayed, altered slightly, had their promotional material swapped due to appearances of the Twin Towers. Sports games were either delayed or canceled. Video games were altered, their packaging was changed, and now you can't even crash into the Twin Towers in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2002. The cultural impact of 9/11 was so deep that every piece of media Americans consumed became affected by it. And I mean every piece. Just to give you an example, something totally minute. The news ticker at the bottom of the screen on 24-hour news networks like CNN was introduced on 9/11 by Fox News of all networks, and it's now a standard practice by news stations that's still there to this very day. FEMA and NIST. FEMA stands for the Federal Emergency Management Agency. After the collapse of the towers in Building 7, Congress and FEMA realized there was no federal agency with authority to conduct technical building failure investigations. The National Construction Safety Team Act was quickly passed, and NIST, short for the National Institute of Standards and Technology, was tasked with investigating why and how the towers fell. FEMA's role was primarily to provide funding for NIST, as well as local cleanup crews and repairs to damaged buildings. NIST, meanwhile, created and conducted state-of-the-art computer simulations, interviewed hundreds of survivors and witnesses, and obtained hundreds of hours of videotapes, in addition to conducting real fire tests in the lab and collecting real pieces of fragmented steel from ground zero. This investigation and subsequent report, published in 2004, is where most of our knowledge of 9/11 and its accompanying evidence comes from. However, of course, it isn't without its critics. Many have taken issue with the way NIST conducted their investigation, saying it seemed that they had their narrative predetermined and they formed all of their evidence around it. We'll get more in depth on the inconsistencies and flaws in the NIST report as we head to Layer 3. Controlled demolitions. This is where the fun begins. Now we're getting into the conspiracy theory parts of the iceberg. The stuff not verified by NIST or FEMA or any of those guys. Congress especially did not want to give any credence to these types of theories. But we're gonna look into it anyway. It's on the iceberg. I gotta talk about it. This entry refers to the belief that the two main twin towers, as well as Building 7, could not have collapsed the way they did without explosive charges hidden in the building. There are many parts of this theory, and some will be explained later on in the iceberg, but I'll try my best to summarize it here. Basically, this all started during cleanup of Ground Zero, where reports of red-hot steel beams and molten metals made some assume the steel beams themselves had actually melted completely. The melting point of steel ranges from 2,500 to 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit, while jet fuel can only burn at a range of 800 to 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. This is where the infamous line, "Jet fuel can't melt steel beams," comes from. And they're right, jet fuel can't melt steel beams. But it sure as hell can soften them up. Steel loses approximately 50% of its strength at only 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit, and the numerous flammable objects in the World Trade Center like rugs, office furniture, printer paper, which can be seen littering the skies in nearly every video from 9/11, didn't help. It's estimated that the temperature inside the inferno was close to 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit, more than enough heat to weaken the beams with.
It's not that it melts in a fire. In fact, normal fires are not hot enough to melt steel. But what happens is it starts to lose its strength. And as it loses its strength, it starts to sag. It becomes softer and sags and can no longer support the load.
Theorists will deflect from this bit of information, pointing at supposed squibs going off as the buildings went down, but it's a structure that was primarily built to have as much room in it as possible. There's gonna be a lot of air trapped in that building. It only makes sense for it to be pushed out the windows like that. Furthermore, these supposed squibs don't make any distinct sound when detonated, which most explosives do when they go off. Even the smallest of explosives make a very loud boom. That's not even touching the fact that the tower supposedly
fell straight down just like a controlled demolition.
Which, no they didn't. There were a whole bunch of these videos putting side-by-side comparison clips up, and these just don't look the same at all. You can see the very obvious tilt of the top half of the South Tower here, The only one that went straight down into its own footprint was Building 7. And well, Building 7 collapse and tenants. World Trade Center 7's collapse was even more picked apart and examined due to the fact that it wasn't hit by a plane, yet suffered a freefall collapse. The official story states that Building 7 suffered massive amounts of damage from the collapse of both twin towers, and subsequent fires and structural damage proved too much for the firefighters to handle. Add that on top of the fact that the building just sat there smoldering for 7 hours, and you have the first steel building to ever completely collapse due to fire. There were also some suspicious government agencies who were taking up tenancy in World Trade Center 7. Not only did the Secret Service have offices in the building, but so did the IRS, the New York City's Office of Emergency Management, and even the CIA, who used the building to conduct surveillance on foreign diplomats based in the UN. It all looks pretty sketchy when you look at it, and I can definitely see why theorists doubt this story. The collapse just does not look the same as the towers before it, and it happened quite a while after the other two as well. However, once you get up close and actually look at the damage World Trade Center 7 suffered, oh god, oh lord, I'm surprised it didn't collapse sooner. Water pressure was practically non-existent in World Trade Center 7 because of burst pipes elsewhere in the complex, meaning that these raging fires were virtually unaffected by the building's sprinkler system.
There's no water on it anywhere.
You also have to keep into account that Building 7 wasn't built like the World Trade Center towers. In addition, while it is the first steel-structured building to collapse primarily due to fires, it isn't the only one. Tehran, 2017, the 17-story Plasco building, which also had a steel frame, caught fire suddenly and collapsed hours later, much in the same way that World Trade Center 2 had, killing 20 firefighters and injuring dozens more. Brazil, 2018, the Wilton País de Almeida building in Sao Paulo suffered an electrical fire which burned for 90 minutes before the building fully collapsed into its own footprint. Most of those inside were homeless, so it's unknown exactly how many were killed. The point is, clearly something like World Trade Center 7 is possible. It's definitely rare, but it's possible. Larry Silverstein and Pullet. Speaking of World Trade Center 7, Larry Silverstein was the leaseholder of World Trade Center 7, organizing its construction in 1980, and later he became the leaseholder of the entire World Trade Center complex, winning the lease in 2000. On 9/11, he actually wasn't present at the buildings he essentially owned, because his wife insisted he go to a dermatologist's appointment he had. Imagine being the owner of the largest buildings in Manhattan that got suddenly destroyed by terrorists, and you can't do anything about it because you're busy getting your skin looked at. In a 2002 interview with PBS, he had this to say about Building 7.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
According to many conspiracy videos, pull it is an old demolition term. To pull the building is to detonate the charges to take it down. Now, mind you, any attempt to search this into Google immediately gives you Building 7 content. Many different forms had conflicting definitions. Some said it was a standard generic term used in a lot of places. Others said it was related specifically to pulling down a pre-weakened structure using cables, and searching demolition terminology provided me with nothing. I want to make it very clear that I'm not an engineer. I'm not an expert on demolition or anything, and I don't want to pretend I know the terms better than anyone else who actually worked in that field. Larry himself said he was referring to the firefighting effort, but that's not really the point. The question that sticks out in my mind is, if you were the owner of these buildings and you were directly involved in a national conspiracy to demolish them without any civilians finding out the truth, Why would you f*** up that badly on national television? It's not like this is a live broadcast or anything. He could just request that bit to be edited out if he realized his mistake later. How could someone so influential to the conspiracy f*** up that badly on national TV and get away with it? He's still alive today. It's more likely that he was actually referring to the firefighters this whole time. Any other explanation just seems way too convoluted to believe. Barry Jennings. Barry Jennings was the Deputy Director of Emergency Services for the New York City Housing Authority, who gave some very interesting testimony on live TV during the events of 9/11. He claimed that before the collapse of the towers, a sudden explosion had trapped him and another man, Michael D. Hess, on the 6th floor of World Trade Center 7. The two had previously entered the building before the second plane struck, and after the explosion, they both struggled to climb to the 8th floor, where they were then rescued by firemen at around noon. You can see Hess shouting for help from a broken window on the 8th floor in this clip. Jennings also claims he was told not to look down as he was, quote, stepping over people, as part of a later interview he did with Dylan Avery. Dylan Avery is one of the producers behind the most infamous 9/11 conspiracy documentary out there, Loose Change. In the same interview, he stresses that the explosion that knocked him back was not caused by the collapse of the towers, which is what the official NIST report claims. Quote, I know what I heard. I heard explosions. The explanation I got was it was the fuel oil tank. I'm an old boiler guy. If it was a fuel oil tank, it would have been on one side of the building. There has been some debate about Jennings' recollection of events. It has been stated by researcher Joël van der Rijden that Jennings and Hess entered at 9:37, closer to the collapse of the South Tower than the impact of the South Tower. This is because an order was made around that time to evacuate the building's OEM bunker, and when the two men made it to the 23rd floor, the bunker was locked. Additionally, Jennings later claimed, when interviewed by the BBC in 2007, that he did not see dead bodies in the lobby of World Trade Center 7, despite Avery literally pulling up the interview on his tiny camera and playing Jennings' own words.
And the firefighter that took us down kept saying, do not look down. And I kept saying, why? He said, do not look down. And we were stepping over people. And you know you can feel when you're stepping over people. I said it felt like I was stepping over them, but I never saw them.
So what's the truth? I doubt we'll ever know. In August of 2008, 2 days before the release of the full NIST report that contradicted him, Barry Jennings died in his hospital bed from unknown causes at the age of 53. Michael Hess refuses any phone calls pertaining to 9/11 and would prefer to be left alone.
Do I think that our government would do something like that to its people? No. I honestly don't believe that. Well, I know that I was in there, heard what I heard, saw what I saw.
Explosion witnesses. There are literally dozens of people who say they heard or saw explosions on the morning of September 11th.
We're being pushed out as well because there was some concern that there might be additional explosions, possibly other bombs.
The entire top of the building just blew up.
There's a second explosion and another explosion. We have a report now of a fourth explosion at the Trade Center.
There has just been a huge explosion.
We heard a very loud blast, an explosion.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse?
To me, it sounded like an explosion.
But it was a huge explosion.
I saw the two buildings. I'm thinking it was a bomb because two of them.
This seems weird until you put into perspective how much misinformation was present in the news during this time. Nobody had any clue what the hell was going on, and any vaguely suspicious report or boom noise was hyped up by the media like they do all the time. There was a report of a fire on the Washington Mall. There was a report of a car blowing up at the State Department. Secret Servicemen were panicking on the roof of the White House about a random plane in the sky that turned out to be nothing. There were initial reports that Flight 93 had successfully landed at Cleveland Airport. No, wait, I'm getting that wrong. Camp David. and then other reports saying that it was shot down by military fighter jets, any weird boom of falling debris or jet fuel from the towers was immediately labeled as an explosion by any reporter that was there.
We've been told by firefighters here that there is a report of a bomb in this building. This is a school, a high school right here.
People also claimed that the plane that hit the South Tower wasn't a commercial airliner.
And the plane wasn't no airline or anything. It was a twin-engine, big gray plane.
It definitely did not look like a commercial plane. I didn't see any windows on the side.
Mark, if what you say is true, those could be cargo planes.
Which is blatantly untrue from all of the footage that we have available. But we'll get into that a little later too. The majority of these are just baseless speculations from scared individuals who've had about as much idea of what was going on as the rest of the world. So it would be smart to take their exact words with a little grain of salt. Building 7 collapse reported early. I don't know why this one is separate from the other Building 7 entry, but yeah. Multiple news stations at that time were speculating that World Trade Center 7 was in danger of collapsing.
Building 7 in the World Trade Center complex is on fire and has either collapsed or is collapsing.
Building 7 at the World Trade Center.
Another building in the World Trade Center complex, which was not struck by an airplane, is in danger of collapsing.
But what this entry refers to specifically is a report from the BBC that was 10 minutes before it actually happened. In fact, they said that Building 7 collapsed a couple of times.
We have an unconfirmed report of a building collapse. At the time...
We'll leave it there for the moment. We've got some news just coming in, actually, that the Salomon Brothers building in New York, right in the heart of Manhattan, has also collapsed.
Never mind the fact that they're all foreigners and probably couldn't point out the right building if they were asked to, but we're very much aware at this point how nobody in the newsrooms had any idea what was going on. Claiming that shitty reporting is proof that the building was a planned demolition is like saying a fly in your soup is proof the waiters are trying to kill you. Steel sold to China. During the cleanup of Ground Zero, enormous quantities of steel from the World Trade Center were gathered and sold at scrap metal auctions to various bidders, with a couple thousand smaller pieces being scattered across the country for display in various museums, memorials, and town municipalities. There's even a piece from the World Trade Center in my small hometown on display outside a small park. Controversy struck after it was reported that Shanghai Baosteel Group Corporation, a Chinese steel company, had purchased about 50,000 tons of steel at a price of $120 per ton. Apparently that price is quite cheap, according to an interview with Q Lee, an analyst with China Securities. Quote, all in all, China's purchase from the World Trade Center ruins counts for little to its steel industry, given the nation's big consumption of scrap each year. But the price of $120 per ton is, if not great, quite reasonable. Families of the victims were understandably pissed off that the steel was just being scrapped, arguing more should have been saved for study and investigation. In response to these people, then newly elected mayor of New York City and would-be candidate for president Michael Bloomberg had this to say: if you want to take a look at the construction methods and the design, that's in this day and age what computers do. Just looking at a piece of metal generally doesn't tell you anything. Which is a horribly insensitive thing to say to grieving families. Despite his callous nature, there doesn't seem to be any conspiratorial motive behind these transactions. You can make the argument that the city was destroying evidence, but clearly there are still a lot of pieces of steel left in the United States today. If I was able to find one, that should tell you something. New York needed to get rid of a lot of metal really fast, so they sold it to an overseas company at a cheap price. Simple as that. Pentagon missile.
I mean, it was like a cruise missile with wings. Went right there and slammed right into the Pentagon.
This entry refers to the idea that a missile crashed into the Pentagon, not an airplane, as the hole seems far too small for a 757 to fit in there. The Twin Towers had pretty huge gaping holes in its facade, so you would think the Pentagon would have the same thing. Also, the security camera's view of the plane is very brief and very small, quite unlike the big dark jet airliner that crashed in New York. But what you also need to remember is that Flight 77 hit many street lamps and even a ground-level generator before striking the Pentagon, meaning the wings may have suffered some structural damage as a result. This is why they're not seen in the hole. That's not even considering the reported stench of kerosene or the multitude of plane parts scattered both inside the building and on the front lawn. As for the security footage, many forget that the lens is a fisheye lens, very prone to distorting objects and making them appear smaller or farther away. If we apply some fisheye distortion correction to a frame of the footage, we can see things become a bit more proportionally aligned. The plane doesn't look nearly as small as it did before. Another thing to note is this purple stripe here. We know that American Airlines planes at that time had red, white, and blue stripes alongside the fuselage. So this looks to be a combination of that color data heavily compressed to save on storage, meaning it looks purple. Henryk Siwiak. Editor's note, that is not how you pronounce his name. I am very, very sorry, Henryk Siwiak. That is how you pronounce his name. This is another one I added. Henryk Siwiak was a Polish immigrant who was working in New York City to support his family back home just before the events of 9/11. His construction gig in Lower Manhattan fell through because the whole area had to be evacuated, and he couldn't afford to wait for work to resume, so he applied for an ad in the classifieds for a cleaning job at a supermarket, located in the Farragut section of Brooklyn. Being an immigrant who spoke poor English and not knowing the area all too well, he arrived in the neighborhood around 11 p.m. and traveled north instead of south, unknowingly heading into what the NYPD called one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the city. Because most, if not all, police personnel were at the site of the former Trade Center, the information gets scarce, but around 11:40 p.m., an argument was heard, followed by gunshots. Siwiak had been shot in the lung and was bleeding profusely. He stumbled to a nearby apartment building and rang the doorbell, but nobody came. He then collapsed in the street at around 11:42 p.m., at which time a 911 call was made. Whatever personnel they had to offer arrived at the scene shortly after, and Henryk Siwiak was immediately pronounced dead. His murder was investigated briefly, but no suspect has been discovered, and media outlets pretty much ignored his story. It's now believed that because of his poor English and his outfit, an all-camouflage getup, he was killed because he was mistaken for a terrorist. He was the last person to die on 9/11, and as such he's the only officially recorded homicide in the city on that day. Jersey Girls. The Jersey Girls are a group of 4 widows who all lost their husbands in the attacks and were instrumental in the formation of the 9/11 Commission. They are Kristen Breitweiser, Patty Casaza, Lori Van Auken, and Mindy Kleinberg, all citizens of New Jersey, hence their name. Although an independent, unbiased investigation was initially rejected by the Bush administration, the sheer volume of their vocal call to arms was enough for Congress to form the commission in late 2002. Joseph Lieberman, who you should be familiar with if you've been to this channel before, even said, quote, "It was impossible for a member of Congress to face the family members and say they wouldn't do something." However, even after the publication of the report in 2004, the Jersey Girls and their affiliated group, the 9/11 Family Steering Committee, had many unanswered questions which they released in a group statement. Here are just a few of the questions addressed to various government officials. To George W. Bush, as Commander-in-Chief on the morning of 9/11, why didn't you return immediately to Washington, D.C. or the National Military Command Center once you became aware that America was under attack? To Thomas Pickard, former FBI Director, please explain why the July 10, 2001 Phoenix memo, which requested a list of aviation schools to investigate for terrorists, got no farther than the FBI headquarters. Why wasn't the Phoenix memo shared with the threat subgroup of the Interagency Security Group? Why weren't the flight schools shut down or the terrorists deported if, quote, the FBI knew terrorists were using flight schools for years, as reported in the Washington Post on September 23, 2001? To Bill Clinton. Why wasn't bin Laden brought to the United States for trial when Sudan offered to extradite him, as claimed by Faith Erwa, Sudan's Minister of Defense? To Donald Rumsfeld. Why did you, immediately after the September 11th attack, say that Saddam Hussein was involved? Some of their questions would later be answered in the NIST report, and some would not. I tried to read to you ones they didn't answer. In 2005, the group disbanded, and the Jersey Girls went back to their normal lives, although they still continue to individually be a part of 9/11 Truth movements. Hani Khanjour. Hani Khanjour was the main and pilot of Flight 77. He was the only to be a trained pilot before 9/11 was even conceptualized. He received his commercial pilot license in 1999 in the United States after being rejected from working at Saudi Air. He traveled back to his homeland of Saudi Arabia to become a pilot, but was once again rejected for seemingly no reason. Frustrated, this is when he began to radicalize his views, and he left for Afghanistan to train with Al-Qaeda. Bin Laden met him at a training camp and selected Khanjour as one of the hijackers since he was already trained. Here he is in July of 2001, pictured with another Al-Qaeda member, Majed Moked, at an ATM in Maryland. The most bizarre piece of information about him is that, despite his well-documented encounters with fellow and members of Al-Qaeda, his entire family refuses to believe that he was one of the men involved with crashing the aircraft. Quote, "We don't know what happened to our son on the plane. He had contacted us 8 hours before the incident to inquire about our health. He was very normal." According to them, he was very meek and polite, and his religious beliefs, while strong, were very much inward rather than extremist. "We thought that he liked the USA," his brother Abul Rahman would later say. "I would think he would give his life to save lives, not to do this." He certainly stands out from the bold and brash Mohammed Atta, whose evil look gave the media heart attacks. In addition, despite being the only one with any flight experience, he was a very poor student when he attended refresher flight classes, reportedly taking over 5 hours to finish what should have been a 2-hour test.
What kind of a student was Hani Khanjour? A slow learner who started concerning his flight instructor when he refused to land the plane or practice stalls and steep turns.
He would just refuse. He would start crying and he would, refuse to do it. He would beg with me, plead with me not to.
It's possible that bin Laden learned he had a license and immediately chose him as leader without a second thought, because, again, nobody else had any flight training at all before the year 2000. While his timid nature is bizarre in comparison to the others, it's not wholly unusual. As the FBI reports, he was just one in a recurring pattern of young, inexperienced men who, quote, fit the personality to be manipulated and brainwashed into the Al-Qaeda network. He just seemed to be another confused and frustrated young man suckered into the promises of religious fanatics. Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. This entry is pretty much what it says on the tin, an organization of independent architects and engineers pushing for the truth behind the events of 9/11. The nonprofit was founded in 2006 by Richard Gage, an architect from the Bay Area who apparently had 20 years of experience in building fireproof, high-rise steel buildings.
Well, I'm an architect of 20 years, a member of the American Institute of Architects, and have been studying steel-framed, fireproof buildings for about that long.
We ask that for clarification because as we get into this, we want people to make sure that you're not just somebody with a wacky idea.
Right.
Out of the numerous 9/11 advocacy groups, this is the one that is the most outspoken, most recognizable, and most criticized. Much of their work peddles the same kind of stuff I've been talking about for the past I don't even know how long. But what's striking is the amount of big-name people they've been able to interact with. Here's a photo of Ed Asner speaking at one of their events. They were set to be in Spike Lee's new docuseries before HBO forced him to cut them out. Here are a couple of their billboards. This one is in Times f***ing Square. This is beyond an internet rabbit hole at this point. This is starting to look like its own religion now.
If you hear the shouting, it's a group of demonstrators who've come. 9/11 was an inside job. Oh, get a life.
Their website, while good for getting a grasp on just what these people believe, is chock full of flat-out lies and statements that make no sense. The group is still holding events to this very day. At the time of writing this part of the script, they have a couple presentations scheduled for this Wednesday. Gage, who was the organization's main speaker and figurehead, will unfortunately not be attending. He was forced to exit the group just last year following several statements he made saying the COVID vaccines were poisonous. Which, yeah, I can understand wanting to strictly focus on 9/11 related activism, even if your activism is inherently flawed, but you fired a conspiracy theorist from your conspiracy theory advocating nonprofit group because he believed in a conspiracy theory. The Open Chemical Physics Journal and NANO-THERMITE. This one requires quite a bit of context. The Open Chemical Physics Journal is just one of many scientific journals published by BANDCAMP science publishers, who have also published over 100 subscription-based academic journals since their founding in 1994. In 2009, a study was published by the journal entitled Active Thermitic Material Discovered in Dust from the 9/11 World Trade Center Catastrophe, written by 9 different authors but primarily spearheaded by Stephen E. Jones, a physicist and former professor at Brigham Young University, who was one of the first to push the controlled demolition theory. Other contributions were made by Dr. Niels Harrit of the University of Copenhagen, and there's even an appearance from one of the members of AE 9/11 Truth. The study claims to have taken 4 separate samples of dust from the World Trade Center collapse and observed small red-gray chips that they claim are thermitic in nature. The chips were dissected to observe their chemical makeup, soaked in solvent to test if they were actually paint chips, they weren't, and ignited when heated up to a temperature of 430 degrees Celsius, or 788 degrees Fahrenheit. Thus, the paper claims the chips are most likely a microscopic form of thermite explosives, known as superthermite, which gives off a more explosive reaction than traditional thermite. Following its publication, the editor-in-chief of the OCPJ, Marie-Paul Pileni, accused the authors of publishing it without her or the board's consent. She subsequently resigned. The official NIST response being that the paper was published less than a year after the conclusion of their investigation was that there was no way to trace the sources of the dust samples, thus the research was inconclusive. Jones challenged NIST to conduct their own studies using their own samples, but NIST declined. Another glaring fault in the paper was that despite claims that the material is nanothermite, the samples were not compared to actual nanothermite. Instead, they were compared with normal commercially available macrothermite, which reacts differently when heat is applied to it. Therefore, the conclusion to this paper is somewhat compromised.
It seems that thermite is talked up quite a lot for its effectiveness at melting through steel, but in reality it falls kind of flat.
It hasn't stopped Jones and other theorists from pushing the nanothermite claim even to this day, but that doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of the goings-on of 9/11 now. But it does begin to scratch a very long runtime. Oh my god, this is not a microdoc anymore. So when I started recording that outro, it was August 30th, and I had planned for part 1 of the Iceberg to be released on September 11th, and part 2 to count as the next Ramtro Studios Halloween special. As you can see, it is now October 25th at the time of me recording this, so that didn't happen. Expect part 2 of the 9/11 Iceberg to come out sometime around December, January. It depends. I have a lot of stuff going on in my life right now. But while you wait, here are a couple of other things that you can look at.
The sky